Hi guys, and welcome to the second lecture of Chapter 8. Now, previously we went over an introduction to what biodiversity is, and today we'll be discussing some of the benefits of biodiversity. Now, first and foremost, biodiversity forms as a foundation for healthy ecosystems, and essentially biodiversity enhances the stability of any given ecosystem. For example, highly biologically diverse ecosystems tend to have very high species diversity. Areas with high species diversity tend to have multiple organisms occupying the same ecological niche. Now, recall from Chapter 4 that a niche is an organism's fundamental or functional role in a community, and it can be almost thought of as an organism's or a species' job within its given ecosystem. Now, when you have multiple organisms occupying the same niche, it is referred to as something called functional redundancy. Now, functional redundancy is a very good thing. Functional redundancy means that if one species goes extinct within an ecosystem, others are there to take its place and continue to provide that ecological role within that given ecosystem. And when we begin to think of the ecosystem biodiversity and the role of functional redundancy, here it can be very useful to think of an ecosystem almost like an ecological Jenga tower. Each level of the Jenga tower here is going to represent a different ecological niche, and each block within a given level is going to refer to a different species. Here, if an ecosystem has high biodiversity, if one species goes extinct, meaning that if we pull one block from that Jenga tower, other species or other blocks are there to pick up the slack and continue to fill the role of that organism and provide support to that ecosystem. However, if too many species are lost in an ecosystem, that ecosystem begins to lose its stabilizing abilities. Basically, if too many species occupying the same ecological niche are removed from an ecosystem, it is as if you are pulling multiple blocks from the same level of your ecological Jenga tower. Here, the ecosystem begins to lose that niche entirely as you remove more and more blocks from that level, and the ecosystem can begin to collapse, very much like pulling out all the blocks from a level in a Jenga tower. Now, it's also important to note that not all species are necessarily equal in terms of how important they are to a given ecosystem and in terms of how important their ecological niche is. Now, again, remember from Chapter 4 that we talked about something called a keystone species. A keystone species is a species which exerts a disproportionate influence on the structure of a given ecosystem. If you want to refer back to your ecological Jenga tower here, a keystone species would be an entire level of a given ecological Jenga tower. Therefore, removal of that ecosystem or that keystone species often results in the entirety of that ecosystem collapsing, even though we are only removing one single species. Furthermore, there are other types of organisms which can also contribute a disproportionate amount of influence on a given ecosystem. Another type is something called an ecosystem engineer, and an ecosystem engineer is a specific type of organism that creates, significantly modifies, and maintains a habitat by physically altering the environmental conditions around it. Basically, an ecosystem engineer fundamentally engineers its own habitat. And by altering these different habitat conditions, ecosystem engineers are able to create environments with very specific and very constant, consistent conditions. These consistent conditions allow for other organisms to adapt and specialize over time, creating very, very complex and very diverse ecosystems. Now, you probably know of several different types of ecosystem engineers and just maybe have never thought of them that way. For example, in the terrestrial environment, elephants are considered ecosystem engineers because they flatten the earth as well as crush and devour plants. And because of this, elephants artificially alter their environment so that the vegetation stays much closer to the ground. Similarly, ants facilitate seed dispersal and promote plant growth by simply cutting down, eating, and devouring different species. And then finally, beavers are probably our easiest conceptually to understand as ecosystem engineers because they physically alter the environment by building dams to slow moving water and to create lakes as well as ponds. However, ecosystem engineers are also very prevalent within the marine environment. Marine ecosystem engineers provide predation refuge and stabilize environmental variation. So in these systems, you're going to have very structurally complex organisms that can alter physical characteristics of the water by simply slowing it down and creating very consistent artificial environments. And ecosystem engineers in the marine realm are going to be things like coral reefs, oyster reefs, algae, seagrass meadows, mangrove swamps, and sponges. And again, by physically slowing down the water so that it has no wave energy, things settle out of the current, you have a very consistent environment for other organisms to specialize in. Now, the loss of an ecosystem engineer can also dramatically alter a habitat due to the loss of the biological pressures and the biological functions exerted by these engineers. So essentially, once you lose the organism that is engineering the environment to be very consistent and stable, you lose those properties, and as a result, specialists which have adapted to that very specific environment are unable to cope with the changes in the environment, and the entire ecosystem collapses. Now, in addition to providing a foundation for many of the ecosystems around the globe, biodiversity has some serious beneficial implications for us as well. For example, within the context of food security, biodiversity provides many of the foods that we like to eat. Humans, over the course of human history, have used at least 7,000 different plant species. But more recently, we have dramatically reduced and narrowed our diet, specifically within the last 150 years. For example, nowadays, 90% of the food we eat comes from just 15 different types of plant species and only 8 different species of livestock. And, similar to ecosystem diversity, a lack of functional redundancy in agricultural diversity leaves us very vulnerable to things like crop failures. For example, if disease wipes out one or more of our crops, we don't necessarily have the redundancy of other crop cultivars or other crop species to fill that role in our diet. So, by maintaining biodiversity around the globe in our wild ecosystems, we have sort of a backup plan in case our food or our crops get wiped out. Now, in addition to providing food security, there are other benefits as biodiversity as well, specifically the provision of drugs and medicines. Now, many medicines have been found in nature, especially historically, and currently, about half of today's pharmaceuticals are derived from chemical compounds that are commonly found in plants. This generates a lot of money. Around $150 billion in sales each year are attributed to plant-based pharmaceuticals, and this also has the benefit of saving lives. This saves thousands of lives each year. And the thing is, we still haven't discovered all of the world's species. It is very likely that many undiscovered species, particularly in tropical environments, have beneficial chemicals which can be used to make new medicines. By maintaining high biodiversity, specifically in tropical rainforests, we can help guarantee to ourselves that these species will survive so that they exist for us to discover and then learn from. Now, while we've gone over a few specific reasons and specific benefits of biodiversity, there are a whole host of other ecosystem services that biodiversity helps ecosystems provide. Things like provisional services, regulating services, and even cultural and supporting services, all of which we have gone over in Chapter 1. Now, in addition to all of this, there is an ethical question here. Aside from all of the benefits of biodiversity, what obligation do we have to safeguard species from extinction? Do species inherently have the right to exist? And do we have a responsibility to keep some of these species alive simply so that they have the right to exist? And is it fair to drive a species to extinction just to extract more of a given resource or carve out even more space to ourselves? Now, these are all really in-depth ethical questions, and they're going to be different from each person, depending on your values and what conclusions you arrive at. But these are questions that we all have to answer because our actions are going to answer them for us if we're not careful. Now, that concludes this lecture on the benefits of biodiversity. I look forward to talking to you again about biodiversity loss for the next lecture in Chapter 8. See you later.